Well, welcome once again. This is the Dr. Digital at the Dr. Digital podcast, and got another exciting episode. I've been looking forward to this for some time, and I really wanted to get Frank on the program, and I'm glad that he came today. What we have today is, I think, a really interesting, exciting guest for so many reasons, because here is somebody that I think people need to hear. Some people comment on institutions from the outside. Frank DeVito works inside them, shaping how they endure, how they fracture, what they demand of the people who serve them. I'm Mick, the Doctor of Digital, and this episode is about authority, not as branding, but as formation, not as visibility, but as something tested inside institutions and that outlasts any one individual. At one point, Frank makes the case that institutions rarely collapse because of external pressure. They collapse because the people inside them lose the clarity and conviction required to sustain them. And with that, I want to welcome Frank DeVito to the program. How are you doing today, Frank?
I'm doing well, Nick. Thanks for having me.
You bet. You know, I've been wanting to get you on the program for some time, so I'm so glad you took time out of your busy schedule to do that. And this is really what I wanted to know and really delve into some of your background. So before you got into the writing and your legal work or the institutions you're a part of, I want to start earlier. So you've worked at a really interesting intersection between law, faith, and public life. When did you first start to see that the real challenge wasn't just defending institutions, but forming the kind of people capable of sustaining them?
Yeah, I guess that probably goes way back into my formation and my personal journey, because before I went to law school, I actually was in formation for ministry. And as a Catholic, that means celibate ministry. So I spent a couple years in seminary, a couple years living in a contemplative monastery, actually. So the focus on formation of persons in virtue was kind of at the heart of what I did for several years as a young adult, and then came out and obviously had to figure out a way to have a career, feed a family, and do all of that. So I think the original attraction to law, frankly, was just I needed a profession that would, provide for a family. And with a background in philosophy and those particular interests, law just kind of seemed like a natural extension of the studies and the interests that I had. Public life more generally, I think I wandered into it almost by accident. As a new lawyer, I worked in first private practice, and then I was a government attorney for a county government agency for a couple years, and didn't really think about politics, policy, institution building really at all. I was just trying to figure out how to be a lawyer. But little by little, I got involved in local politics through some friends, and that's really where all of this came about kind of organically. I had a friend who was a really good guy, and I wanted to help him. So I worked on a couple of congressional primary campaigns and wrote some speeches introducing him to certain audiences. I wrote some policy for him. And then I realized that I had things to say and I cared about them, about building institutions, about policy matters. And then when I started turning the campaign ideas into publishable essays, into speeches, it turned out that I was, clearly fairly good at them because people would publish them and pay me to do them. But also I really enjoyed the work. So that's how I've ended up here.
So from your vantage point, then where do institutions most often begin to break down, and why is it usually invisible at first?
Yeah, so I think institutions can mean a lot of things, right? Most generally, that's just any intermediary between the individual and, I suppose, the state. So everything from the family to the school to the civic association to the think tank to a business, these are all institutions. But I think I'm most familiar with the world of nonprofit institutions, both religious and secular. So I guess I'll speak from that side. So I think where they break down is mostly mission creep, which I think is a big focus area, especially with the leadership that has helped train me in the world of nonprofits. It's very easy to, and it's a creep, right? So that's why I think it happens invisibly. I think that's where people often get off course, is that your organization is formed to do something particular, right? That could be more or less wide. It might be one specific program. This is why we exist. It might be a more general few policy goals or common good works or what have you. But those are clearly defined, especially for nonprofits, right? You have articles of incorporation that'll say what your exempt purposes are, and then generally you have some kind of a mission statement articulating that a little bit. But an organization from its founding should have a couple sentences that explains this is what we are, this is what we're here for. And it's very easy to creep away from that. I think for a couple of reasons. I think sometimes it might just happen slowly and organically without intentionality, right? You have this kind of core mission, and then you get interested in something that's close to it or that does fit around the peripheries of your mission. But then that starts to take focus for a number of reasons. It might just be more interesting to the leadership, or sometimes, frankly, it brings in more money, right? It interests donors, more of a hot topic, or it just interests the current staff or leadership. And then all of a sudden you find yourself more there than at the core of your mission. And then once you're doing that thing at the peripheries, then you start to get into other programs or projects that are surrounding that new program. And then before you know it, you haven't stopped and evaluated that you're no longer doing what your organization exists to do.
So you had a great deal of formation yourself, this personal side. So that also means in practice. I'm curious about that. What does formation actually mean in practice beyond education or credentials? What is formation about?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, my own view of this is colored by religious faith, but I think this carries over fine into the secular world. That formation involves the formation of character and of virtue, not just formation and information and subject matter expertise. I don't think this is formation beyond education. I think classically, through most of human history, it was understood that education includes this cultivation of virtue and skills that are outside of subject matter expertise. So on the intellectual level, right, learning how to think, read, write, debate at a deep level, regardless of whether you're going to be, a lawyer or an engineer. These are just parts of what it means to be a human, to know how to communicate clearly and think deeply about issues. But then also, just generally the formation in virtue is part of what a proper education should be. How do you conduct yourself with prudence, with temperance, with courage, with justice? These things matter deeply. And again, these aren't just religious values. These are important for anybody to thrive as a professional and just as a human being. I'm happy to get into that further if you'd like.
And this is often what is missing. That's why I think it's so important to talk about formation and education. So where do you see institutions overvaluing information while neglecting formation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of it is probably the way that hiring is done in the first place, right? Yeah, there's a lot of very resume credential heavy hiring. You can see this especially in law, especially at the elite levels of law, where big white shoe law firms, the prestigious firms, or prestigious judges hiring clerks. It's mostly a credential game. Where did you go to law school? What maybe the LSAT score, maybe the GPA, maybe what extracurriculars you were, talented enough to get on. And obviously those are signs of something important, right? People who have the skills, the capacity to do things that are competitive like that, to get onto a law review at an elite institution, for instance, they show you something about how capable the person is intellectually, but it doesn't tell you that much once they've made it into a position about how dedicated they'll be to the mission. I think without that centrality of virtue and really screening for, is this person serious about our mission and about living a virtuous life? You get everything from laziness and maybe distraction from core parts of the work to preference for personal benefit and prestige over the good of the organization and its mission. Not saying you just go and hire the most saint-like person, irrespective of resume, but I think character and virtue should be a core part of the selection process. And when you're overvaluing, information and papered credentials over formation and virtue, that can be a real crack in institutional health.
So if the formation is weak, what happens when pressure is applied with weak formation?
Yeah, somebody with all of the subject matter expertise and the education and the credentials is promising, but they don't like their boss, so they check out or they undermine, right? deadlines get hard and the person doesn't like the particular work that they're doing on a given project at a given day, all the intelligence and all the credentials in the world won't make up for not having the determination, the commitment to justice, the flexibility to pivot. You really can't make up for lack of virtue. And I think it really shows under strain when things get hard, when things get unpleasant, when leadership is a little bit problematic or you just disagree with them. The virtuous person will strive to grow through that, but the really smart, credentialed person might not.
So leaders are really important. It's an obvious point, but what distinguishes the leaders then who can carry institutional weight from those who cannot?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is what I've already said, right? If the leadership is not virtuous and doesn't cultivate those character traits, then it's kind of hard to expect that of your downstream subordinate staff. But I also think that there's this hard balance in leadership between delegation and also ultimate responsibility. Maybe this is an obvious point, but on one hand, right, you can have micromanaging leadership, which can stifle staff. And I've definitely seen that a lot. But I think on the other end, you can get, who is it? Oh, Jocko Willink. I don't know if you've heard of him, the Navy SEAL, who's got a huge podcast and has been a big, motivational speaker and business coach and all of that. But he talks about extreme ownership from leadership. I really like that concept that if you have subordinate staff, you delegate, you give them responsibilities, you give them tasks, they report them back to you. But ultimately, you're responsible for their failures, right? If one of them doesn't produce the quality of product, doesn't get things done on time, that's on you as a leader. And if you don't take that responsibility, I think that shows a lot of weakness and can be a really big problem for an organization, because ultimately, if they're not doing something right or they're not doing something to the fullest extent of their abilities, that's on you. Lack of motivation, lack of appropriate feedback, encouragement, whatever it is, responsibility has to be taken from the top. The other thing that I'll see that I think is important to say about leadership is that, and this is from my own growing experience, not that I've always been involved in smaller institutions, so the number of people that I oversee has always been small, but even overseeing just a couple of people, one of the adaptations I've had to make and come to acknowledge is that leadership or management over a department or over a project really looks nothing like doing the job yourself a lot of the time. But it's also often actually more work. At least that's what I've come to try to grapple with, right? If I'm, for example, like my staff, my interns especially, I'm not doing nearly as much of the writing, the research, putting together the resources for nonprofits that my organization does, as when I was just staff counsel, writing and publishing things myself. Often what I'm doing is coming up with what needs to be done, delegating it to interns and staff. But it really is more work because I have to come up with, what is the capacity of each staff member? What can they handle? How much supervision do they need? I have to watch each subordinate and make sure that I'm not giving them too much or too little so they're bored. But then I have to do a lot of editing, and I try to make the editing not just impersonal, but a teaching moment. Like I'm passionate about making people better writers. So everything that I get from an intern or a staff member, I'll redline in detail. And then I often try to go back and actually meet with them and explain, this is why I changed this. This is why I changed that. And that's necessary for leadership, right? Because then I'm forming better writers. It would be easier in some sense for me to just fix it, publish it, call it a day, less mentoring. But I don't want to do that because I want to be mentoring. But also ultimately, if I'm going to improve the quality of the work of the people working under me, I have to make sure that I'm actually helping them to be better rather than just fix and move on.
Yes. If you're a leader, you can't just keep looking behind you as they're following. No, you have to build them up. So also I wanted to mention, because you've written across a range of respected publications and authored a book, which we'll get to, of course. What were you trying to capture in your writing that couldn't be expressed inside an institution alone?
Yeah. So within my institution, first of all, I work at the Napa Legal Institute. We're focused on religious liberty issues and nonprofit law issues. So part of the reason I do so much writing outside of that is just because it's in my personal capacity, and I have a lot of interests, things that I think are important to be said in the public square on politics, policy, religion, culture, law that are just outside the scope of what Napa Legal does. So my own institution, a lot of that is not the appropriate forum for a lot of what I want to say. So writing in my personal capacity is just a necessity. But I think more generally, why do I write? Everything that I write is for a particular purpose. I've identified something that I think needs to be said that's not already being said by a lot of voices, or else it's not worth doing. And then also, I always identify the particular audience. So I think that's really important for writers. What do you want to say, and to whom do you want to say it? Because that will affect everything from where you publish it, the tone, the style, right? If I'm talking to academics, I'm going to write in a very different way than if I'm talking to average readers of a magazine, average voters. If I'm saying something that I think needs to be heard in the circles of like mid-level staffers in Washington, D.C., who are talking to the people who make policy, I'm not going to be writing for a religious magazine. I'm going to be writing for a publication that I know that that audience is reading. So I always try to be very careful that I'm saying the right thing to the right people, and also that it's not already being said to death, because I have the benefit of not having to write a column or produce a certain number of words per week. So why say things that are already being said? If I don't have something unique to add to the discourse, then I don't write it.
What changes when ideas move from those internal discussions to a public articulation?
Yeah. Internal discussions, you can be a lot more free to develop an idea out loud, right? Often I'll have conversations with friends or with my wife, about a certain issue, and you can really just be developing the idea through the conversation. You can say things, then somebody makes a criticism, and then you backtrack, and then you refine, and you can basically flesh out your idea in the conversation. Once you're publicly publishing, of course, you can still do that, right? No essay or no book is the last word. People will criticize your work, and I've actually been able to engage in some really fruitful conversation based on that. I've written essays just in the last few months that a couple of prominent commentators have responded to critically, and we've actually become friends. Two of them in particular have pointed out, I disagree with DeVito's treatment of this, this, and that, and then I responded charitably. And if you can do that with humility, you can actually make public writing into a dialogue. And a fruitful one. But that being said, I think to answer your question, going from internal discussion to public articulation, you do have to realize that it's not a back and forth. You're putting something out in print that is there, and people are going to engage with it. So I try to be very careful that, I've covered my bases. I've rethought the points. I do my best to make sure that I'm not being intellectually sloppy or lazy, because once it's there, it's there. It's not a conversation. It's in print.
It's kind of interesting area then to have more of a dialogue. So if you were writing, maybe give some examples. What need to be clarified or what deepened based on some of these discussions you've had?
Oh, yeah. So I think, well, I don't know if you want to get into, because this is a political, religious, probably a little bit of a hot button issue, is the one that I've been talking through a lot. Actually, no, I'll use a different one. So I've been involved in the public square in some conversations about, this is in the nitty gritty for lawyers, but the role of natural law, right? Like the law that endures, that is universal, no matter what a public, legislature says in a particular country or time. And the role of judges, right? Do judges in the American tradition have the ability to say, well, this statute or this constitutional provision was enacted properly by our lawmakers, but it conflicts with the natural law, and therefore it's not enforceable or not valid? That's a hard question, highly disputed even among like conservative intellectuals in the legal world. And that's been an ongoing dialogue. I've written things on that. I've interviewed judges and talked to academics about this issue, and it's a constant rewrite and refining. I'll talk to one person and I maybe I'm not fully convinced, but they'll point me to a different resource. And so I read that and I refine the argument a little bit, and then talk to different people who come from different angles. So I think having the humility to take criticism and not just treat it like you're in a war on Twitter every time, somebody disagrees with something you've written is really helpful, both to your own, again, character development, like how do you take criticism, but also to the public discourse. Because if I write something somebody writes something else disagreeing with it, and then I just call them names or talk about what a hack they are. That's completely not just unhelpful, but I think really damaging to the public discourse. Whereas I think if you can make the public example of, I was disagreed with in public and I reacted and said, oh, maybe you're right, I have to reconsider this. I think that can do a lot for public virtue, I guess, for lack of a better word, to be an example of, if someone disagrees with you, maybe be a little bit humble and reconsider rather than just going on the attack. I think that's really important, especially for people in the public square, to pattern and lead with that kind of behavior.
Yeah, so it certainly would delve into faith and faith issues. It sounds very good here. So if you operate, which you do, within faith-based institutional context, what role does faith play in sustaining institutions over time?
Yeah, so I think, let's see, if you just look historically, pretty much every society that has endured at all has some kind of a cohesive, religious faith or narrative myth, something in common, right? From the Greeks and the Romans and their mix of both their pantheon of gods, but also their shared moral inheritance and so on. Every non-Greek or Roman ancient civilization has had some kind of a religious glue that holds them together. So I don't know. In a lot of ways, the modern world the modern West anyway, is an interesting test of whether it is in fact possible to have enduring institutions and enduring society that holds together without some kind of a common faith. Because America and a lot of Western European countries are really experimenting with that, shedding their Christian heritage and trying to be united by, I don't know, secular humanism or commitment to human rights or whatever, without faith as a glue. I'm fairly pessimistic that that's possible, to be honest, without those deeply rooted shared understanding of transcendent meaning, why we're here, why we exist. I don't know if institutions or society can really hold together. I think we're in the midst of seeing whether that's the case or not.
Well, we have some institutions to take a look at that. NATO might be one secular institution. How well has that worked out? So, I mean, there's things that, kind of lend yourself to that, and cultures and civilizations survive because, and one of the primary components of it is religion, after all. So what else? It's a question that a lot of philosophers have asked. Nietzsche, for example, what do we do if God doesn't exist? What do we do now? So I think it's a really live and interesting and open question to be considering. So I did want to dive into some of the work that you've done, more so the recent work too. So mention your book and tell us about the book, how'd that come about, and the topic.
Yeah, so it's called J.D. Vance and the Future of the Republican Party, which I'm very quick to say to people, if you're not a fan of J.D. Vance, if you're not a member of the Republican Party, I think it's still very valuable, because what I did was, first of all, I observed that whether you like him or not, J.D. Vance is an important figure, both because of his background, his really meteoric rise in politics from like nobody a few years ago to a senator to vice president in a very short time. But also, we're at a very interesting moment, right? Donald Trump has, no matter what you think about him, has completely reshaped the Republican Party and in a lot of ways American politics. He's led the Republican Party now for a decade, and he's realigned the coalitions that make up the party, changed a lot of policy priorities, and he's going away. And so who his successor is, who the next person is in the post-Trump Republican Party, is going to have real ramifications for what does the Republican Party look like? What do American politics look like? Is Trump this anomaly and we go back to business as usual? I don't think that's likely. What happens next is a live question. So everything from policy priorities to basic political philosophy, right? What does the Republican Party actually believe and prioritize? Those are open questions. And a lot of the leadership in the post-Trump Republican Party will have very different opinions of that. But Vance was very young and was chosen even though he really didn't provide a whole lot of demographic electoral advantage to Trump, right? He's a young, white, Christian, straight guy from a reliably red state. I don't see any reason that you would choose him except that you are picking a potential leader for the party. So I think he's worth paying attention to. and also he's an intellectual and a writer. He's been writing really interesting stuff since way before he was even a politician. So a very interesting person to profile, and I think an important person for America to pay attention to, again, regardless of what you think of him.
Sure. So let's say he is a leader, and let's assume that he is, and he's responsible for carrying the institution, in this case, the Republican Party, because things have totally reshaped and American politics has changed as a result of, let's say, the Trump phenomenon. What should leaders focus on currently with this change that we know is coming in 28?
Oof. That's a tough question. I think there's so much that I could say here. So I guess I'll just keep myself focused on one thing. I think there are a lot of debates that have dominated politics for a long time that are maybe now, maybe circumstances are just a little bit different, right? There's a lot of questions about capitalism and taxes, and even political philosophy about libertarianism, how big or small the government is. And those are all necessary policy fights. But I think what's worth focusing on, and why Vance is such an interesting figure to me, is that this is not an anti-capitalist critique, but just the reality is the stock market is surging, right? There are people in the tech sector making tremendous amounts of money. From GDP standpoints, America looks great, but median wages, employment opportunities for middle America, for like the people who make up our citizenry, we're not in a great place. And that disparity is what I think policymakers and people involved in institutional leadership really should be taking a closer look at. And it's one of the things I really appreciated about JD Vance saying we need to refocus on what the American dream is. It's less about making sure that we have more money and fancier degrees and more cars and bigger houses than our parents and grandparents, and more about how do we make sure that getting married, having children, and having meaningful work to support a family is a dream that's as accessible to as many Americans as possible. So I'd say that's, I think, the big shift that needs attending is making sure that we are attentive to the fact that the middle class is in danger of shrinking and disappearing into, a world of, like, I don't want to be too exaggerating here, but of tech oligarchs, and then a lot of people who are lost in a world of AI and lack of meaningful work. And it's beyond my pay grade to figure out how we deal with that problem, but it's a very big problem now, exacerbated by AI and the emergence of all these tech changes.
But it's such a good and fascinating area to discuss. That's why it is so important. So if leaders are preparing for that, because there is something about the challenge of the American dream and does it work and exist. But going back to the Vance example, well, who would you want as a better example of how to get into the middle class than Vance, given his impoverished background and difficult young life? So what should leaders be thinking of if they do want to resuscitate the American dream for this century?
Yeah, so a lot of it will be on the level of policy, and I don't know that I'm not a policy expert in any particular field, but I think just reorienting some of our conversations, like there's some really good work on labor policy being done in the current Department of Labor, but also by a lot of think tank people and writers in this area, about maybe we start to take our central focus about economic health and make it less about GDP and more about median wages and the buying power of a median wage. That's a really important policy level question. But I think on the more personal level and less grand policy is this is hard to articulate in like 1 minute here, but so Pope Leo XIII, who wrote the encyclicals in the Catholic world that have really started the modern understanding of Catholic social doctrine, right? How do we treat the economy? How do we treat the worker in a humane way? He wrote in his encyclical in the late 19th century, Rerum Novarum, he's talking about, right, capitalism and private property, unions. What's the Catholic take on kind of balancing the power of capital and the rights of the worker? But one of the things he says that always sticks with me is there are some things that we can't really legislate, but the wealthy have a duty to the worker and to the poor that they need to be very careful about. And so maybe I'd apply that to institutions. And I've talked to a lot of lawyers about this, that maybe it's not your best ROI option, but in a world where lawyers can start to replace paralegals or even like new lawyers with AI tools, maybe we take a little bit of a hit to our bottom line and say, no, I'm going to do the human thing and actually employ a person, because we need another generation of lawyers who are actually, being formed, being brought up so that they can one day do the work that I'm doing. And so it's hard to prescribe that in policy, but I think that that's something really important for leadership to, and the wealthy maybe in particular, to carry with them, is maybe to do the unorthodox thing in the American capitalist system, and not just think about what's the most profitable, but what's necessary for the good of humanity and society. And that's an individual reflection, I think, for each person in their own position. It might hurt a little bit and it might involve thinking very differently, but I think it is worth focusing on, humanity and the common good a little bit more, and your bottom line maybe just a little bit less, to the extent you're able.
Well, Frank, we covered a lot of ground and a lot of things, and more to be said, obviously, but I think it would be great if people reached out to you. So please tell them how to get the book, how to get a hold of you, and what would you recommend in terms of contacting you for further information and a follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. So the book is, again, it's called J.D. Vance and the Future of the Republican Party. As much as I love your average paper bookstore, the place to get it is Amazon. You can also do it through Barnes & Noble. There's an audiobook now, so you can find it online the typical way you'd find books. To follow anything that I'm doing and to get in contact, which I always appreciate, but LinkedIn is where I'm most active. It's actually where we got in contact. So if you find me, Frank DeVito, at LinkedIn, I do respond to every legitimate message I get, and I love connecting with people that way. So that's the best way to get me and to see what I'm up to.
Awesome. Well, I thank you for your time. I know you're a busy guy. You're producing a lot of work, very interesting work, and a great intersection of different issues. I think it's really vital to have these type of conversations. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate all the insights that you provided, and hopefully people reach out to you, because it's well worthwhile. I did, and I don't regret it.
Oh, I really appreciate the time. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you,
Frank. We'll try to produce some of the best things that we can. And if you like the program, by all means, subscribe, like, and also if you want to support the people who support me, and that is the publishers of both Burning America and On Track, Ian Hunter. Those people are supporting the program. I appreciate everything they're doing. So like, subscribe. We got more guests coming, more coming your way. Until next time, Deus Volt.